Thank you, John. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the chance to come in and talk about the Capitol, one of the great structures in America. We tried to wrap it up and put a big bow on it for you, but we got started a little bit late. We didn't get the job done, and I hope you forgive us for that. But tonight, when you go over to the Capitol building for the get-together, I guess you go through the basement entrance on the east side, because everything else is pretty well blocked off. The history of Missouri's Capitol goes back a long ways. We have a tendency to take our Capitol for granted, but because it always seems to have been there, at least certainly in our lifetimes. But we know that a lot of things went into it before it was ever built. Historians know that we can appreciate the places and the people more if we know about their origins and the things that went into building them. So today I'm going to tell you some of the stories of our Missouri Capitol and of Missouri's capital city. Our Capitol involves a lot of decades of uncertainty, populated with dreamers and schemers and statesmen and grafters, and a series of real estate frauds that began with an obscure, illiterate Frenchman living in Spanish Missouri in the southern part of the state. Back in 1785, a couple of brothers from the Three Rivers area of Quebec by the name of Joseph and Francois Le Sueur went down the Mississippi River hoping to set up a trading post somewhere in what is now southeast Missouri with local Indians. They located a Delaware Indian town and several other Indian villages nearby, and in 1789 they built a stockade and a house at a place that was later known as New Madrid. Francois Le Sueur and his first wife moved to the community to stay at the community of Little Prairie in the 1780s, and that was now the New Madrid district as it was known. They named one of their 7 children Godfrey Le Sueur, and in 1818 he married a woman named Mary Loyon, and all of that will become significant to you later. They came here from Vincennes, Indiana, and also from Vincennes at that time was a family named DeLille, whose oldest child was named Mary Charlotte, and she married a fellow in July of 1793 named Charles Loyon, and they came to Missouri in the New Madrid district probably around 1796 or 97. Now, in 1802, her younger brother, Jean-Baptiste DeLille, acquired a Spanish land grant of 200 arpents. That works out to about 160 acres near the village of Little Prairie along a lake called Lake Gayoso, which has since disappeared from the maps and is probably now under the mud of a wildlife area along the Mississippi River. Little Prairie is near where Carruthersville is now. The Spanish official who approved this grant of farmland was Francois Le Sueur. By then he was commandant of Fort San Fernando, which had become the site of Little Prairie. The territory of Orleans became the 18th state, Louisiana, in April 30th of 1812. This area was increased in territorial status and given a new name at that point. For the first time we were officially called Missouri. Some of you say Missouri, and I'm not going to argue with you, but that's all we have to argue about. We're missing some other great topics. Baptiste DeLille got his land grant confirmed by representatives of the new American government in March of 1806. He and his uncle left the area in the fall of 1811, or in the spring of 1811, going to New Orleans, carrying some peltries down there, and they stayed for several months, and so they apparently were not in this area when the great earthquake of 1811 and 1812 destroyed the community and his land. He came back in the fall of 1812, but he apparently stopped only long enough to get married before he became a deckhand on a barge going to Louisville and Pittsburgh, and during that trip he learned that his wife had died, and with his wife dead and his land destroyed by the great earthquake, there was no reason to come back to the New Madrid district. Congress in 1815 passed a Disaster Relief Act that allowed those whose property had been destroyed in the great earthquake to get federally set aside land and substitute their damaged land for this new federal land. Well, land speculators very quickly got advance word of Congress's actions, and they flocked down to southeast Missouri. And they bought up this land, damaged land, for pennies, and then they used that land to make claims that gave them some of the most valuable property in Missouri, including some in central Missouri here. Many of the claims were based on forgery or perjured testimony. While some citizens harmed by the quake were damaged, other citizens caught on to what was going on and they decided they would defraud the frauders, so they sold their property several times to several of these speculators. Well, among the speculators was a St. Louis lawyer by the name of Angus Langham and another man named Thomas Hempstead, also a lawyer. They claimed to be the legal representatives of Baptiste DeLille when Territory Secretary Frederick Bates in November of 1817 issued certificate number 347 to them, allowing them to replace the damaged lands that the DeLille family had owned in southeast Missouri with good federal land that had not been otherwise put up for sale elsewhere, including here. Now in 1820, Charlotte DeLille, who now was the widow Loyon, married Francois LeSueur, one of the founders of Little Prairie, and their daughter Christine was born later that year. By 1822, Langham, Charles Hempstead, Thomas Hempstead, and a fourth speculator named Taylor Berry, who was one of the founders of Columbia, had bought a number of outstanding New Madrid certificates. John Baptiste DeLille's family members, who sold all of their interests in the certificate in the name of Baptiste, who was then called a deceased brother of the grantee. Remember these names because it's an interlocking relationship, because we're going to come back to you. I'm going to shift the focus of our story a little bit, because in 1820, Congress allowed the territory of Missouri to hold an election to pick people who would write the first constitution for when we became a state, and to form a state government. And one of the first challenges that they faced was trying to find a place for a temporary state capital. The first legislature would pick the location for a permanent one. The first draft of the new Constitution taken to the convention in July of 1820 required a permanent seat of government to be in the central part of the state on the Missouri River within 40 miles of the mouth of the Osage. Now some attribute that provision to the Montgomery County Representative Josiah Ramsey. Josiah Ramsey wanted the village of Cote Sandesson, and various people pronounce it in different ways, which was in his district. He wanted that to be chosen for the capital. He also wanted to make sure a new but rapidly growing community named Boonville was outside the limits of that 40-mile limit. So that's why it was written in. The new Constitution said the move of the permanent seat of government to central Missouri would be in 1826, and it would take until then because of the time necessary to properly develop a home community for it. The struggle for a temporary site until the permanent location could be chosen began when the House of Representatives passed a bill that designated Potosi as the temporary capital, but the Senate refused to act on that. A Senate counterproposal favored Cote Sandesson, the only settled community in the area that was outlined in the Constitution for the future permanent capital too. It was about 10 miles downstream from where we're now meeting, at a place that we now call Clark's Hill, which is now a state site. And I was out there just the other day, climb up to the top of a bluff, and that's where William Clark saw some things, and he could look downstream a little ways and see Cote Sandesson, which is French for a hill without design. It was founded as a French village in 1808, and it was on some 4,000 arpents of land that was granted by the Spanish government to one Baptiste du Choquet, who was an uneducated trader. It was named after a shapeless limestone hill that interrupts the river bottom between bluffs a mile or more away, and cut that way by the course of the river for many years. It was the westernmost American settlement at the time. The community survived an Indian attack during the War of 1812 that killed several Indians who torched the powder magazine, which blew up and killed them in the process, and they took off. No survey was ever done under the Spanish government of this community, nor was one recognized by the United States until a federal land patent was granted to du Choquet in 1821. He transferred his holdings to, and this is where the plot begins to thicken, folks, Angus Langham and his friends. And this was more than 3 months after the commission made its first report to the legislators recommending Cote Sandesson for the temporary capital. The House rejected the idea. Suggestions for St. Louis or St. Charles or Franklin or Florissant or Herculaneum, St. Genevieve, and even Boonville also failed. The House, by a single vote, endorsed Franklin further upstream, but the Senate rejected the proposal and then suggested, let's just step back, cool off, and take another run at this. And when they came back, the two chambers quickly agreed on a temporary capital being in St. Charles. Now, while those negotiations were going on, the House was starting the process of selecting the permanent site. They had 5 commissioners picked by Alexander McNair, the governor, and they were to find that place. And their duty was to pick 4 vacant and unclaimed sections of United States government land. And that land then would be given to the state as the site for the permanent state capital. The commission reported to the legislature that it could find only 3 breaks in the towering bluffs along the river that could be possible sites. And 2 of those locations were unavailable. One was about 4 miles from the mouth of the Osage. But it had to land, and land was already claimed by 2 other men, so that didn't work. The next site with some access was a few miles further upstream that had 4 narrow but usable access points from the river to the tops of the bluffs in Township 44, Range 11, as the surveyors like to call it. And then that was about 10 miles above Cote Sandestin. Another acceptable opening was about 10 or 12 miles further upstream near Montauk Creek, which was pretty close to the end of the 40-mile limit, but it already was inhabited by a bunch of people from Tennessee, so that wasn't going to work out. So the situation left only this one place in Township 44 as an acceptable alternative. You see it there as the city of Jefferson in this 1823 map. The commissioners complained, though, that the bluffs were difficult to access despite the openings to the river, and the surrounding landscape could not support any considerable population or extensive settlement. The commissioners were lavish in their praise of Cote Sandestin. The extensive bottomlands could support a good population, they said. Furthermore, the mouth of the Osage River, a route to the southern part of the state, was just across the Missouri from where this village was. But the land titles were a mess. They were uncertain. A good part of the uncertainty seemed to lie with our friend Angus Langham, who also was the Deputy Surveyor General in St. Louis, which was a position that gave him access to all kinds of land issues and land transactions that could benefit him and his law firm before many other people knew about it. Langham seemed to own or control hundreds of the most desirable areas in Cote Sandestin. But there was some doubt about the legitimacy of his claims, some of which were based on New Madrid certificates. The legislature passed a bill giving commissioners more time to unscramble the land title issue. The legislature also decided to hedge its bets, however, by having Governor McNair tell the United States Land Office about the state's interest in Township 44, Range 11, and asked that it be withdrawn from private availability so the state's interest would be protected, if that was what they finally decided to settle. Those concerns about land titles killed Cote Sandestin's chances of ever being the capital. And a few days later, the House voted to have a special committee draft a bill designating the land in Township 44 as the permanent seat of government. The decision became final when Governor McNair signed the first bill in 1822, the first day of the year. Now, after all those negotiations, discussions were still underway about the selections of the site that the commissioners had considered to protect themselves and the Constitution and the law. It was a site they could see little good for using and little good for having. They expressly declared their opinion that Township 44, Range 11, was unsuitable. We today are meeting in that unsuitable site. McNair signed a supplementary bill on the 11th of January telling commissioners to lay out a town that would be called the city of Jefferson. He said May 5th is the day for the sale of the lots, although he knew that there were questions about the land ownership of that site. Because when he had notified the Surveyor General in St. Louis of the decision, McNair was told that Langham and 2 other men had filed claims from New Madrid certificates in the name of Jean-Baptiste Delisle, deceased. 26 days before the legislature passed its resolution asking the land be withdrawn by the federal government, they had filed their claims. Well, the General Assembly at the end of 1822 authorized the purchase of land rights from Langham and his buddies, and if they wanted to fight, the state would condemn the property and just take it away from them. It was probably the first use of eminent domain in Missouri history. Lawmakers decided they would offer as much as $4,000. And Langham decided he would take the money and run. So the deed transferring ownership of 56 lots and their adjacent streets was filed with Cole County Recorder in May of 1823. The sale of the first lots in the city of Jefferson produced $6,540. That same day, the town trustees let the contract for a new building that would house state government. It would cost $24,789 to build. The building was not to be a capitol, it was the governor's house. The governor would share that with the legislature until a state house was erected. As the law provided, specifications for the building said 2 of the apartments shall be suitably constructed and furnished for the use of the General Assembly until the state house shall be erected. But there was no immediate movement to build that second building, the State House, not until the governor's house burned down in 1837 was a new capitol finally erected on the outskirts of town, on the western edge. So one would think that the issue had been settled now, with the crafty Angus Langham and his cronies out of the picture, lots being sold, and a government building that had been operating now. And it was settled until 1842, when the deceased John Baptiste DeLille showed up in Vincennes, Indiana. Since leaving New Madrid, he had joined the United States Army, fought in the War of 1812, and he was in Upper New York when the war ended, and he stayed there for 22 years. He married, and his wife had 4 children. Cholera killed all 5 of them. He finally gave up in New York, moved to Kentucky, and spent a couple of years there. Then he went to the Vincennes area in 1842 to visit his sister, and he married his 3rd wife there. The word of DeLille's reappearance traveled quickly to New Madrid County, Missouri, and reached 2 prominent citizens, Godfrey LeSire, Francois' son, and Dr. Robert Dawson. Godfrey was the son of the county's founder and the man who had approved DeLille's initial grant for the land. And Dawson was a prominent doctor who had a member of the 1820 Constitutional Convention. They realized the importance of the living, breathing DeLille, and they recognized an opportunity here. So that fall, LeSire convinced DeLille to sell him his property for $100. The deed was filed in Cole County in November of 1842, and that immediately served notice on the legislature and others that there was a new challenge to who owned the place where there was the permanent seat of government. At some point, LeSire and Dawson must have realized the difficulties they would face if they won this lawsuit, because the state would expect to recover from them the hundreds of thousands of dollars it had invested in setting up this town and building the buildings and otherwise developing it. Therefore, rather than demanding ownership, these 2 men petitioned the state government for just compensation for the release of their claim. The House Judiciary Committee couldn't see any defect in the state title of those properties, and it could not recommend any compensation at all be paid. Even if DeLille still owned the land, said the committee, he had forfeited it in 1824 for non-payment of taxes. And the result was the title of the state, said the committee, is in no wise endangered by the DeLille claim. Complicating the whole issue was the destruction by fire of the original governor's house in 1837. The fire destroyed a lot of early land records, making it hard to prove the original Langham claims were fraudulent. The committee recommended the state pay LeSire and Dawson families $4,000 to buy them out, but the legislature said, no, we're going to fight them in court. And so early in 1846, a lawsuit was filed asking that a judge hear the case without a jury. The lawsuit challenged the ownership of lots occupied by most of Jefferson City's principal businesses and government buildings, including the 4 blocks reserved for the new capitol. It specifically targeted the lot that was the home of Thomas Lawson Price, the first mayor of Jefferson City. DeLille testified that he was not aware of any provisions made by the government of the United States for the relief of people who were damaged by the New Madrid earthquake. He was in New York at the time. They had no knowledge of this going on until LeSire told him in 1842 this is what had happened. The state's lawyers argue that if DeLille had not, in fact, sold his land and the New Madrid certificate that went with it until 1842, there had been no legal transaction made with Langham, and thus there was no legal survey of the transfer site in Cole County in the 1820s, and therefore the New Madrid certificate had no validity whatsoever. The judge's ruling in 1848 declared that DeLisle's ignorance of any of the events in his absence meant that Langham and friends were not entitled to the certificate, and therefore this next generation of speculators was not entitled to make any claims under that certificate to begin with. The case grew complicated when it went to the Missouri Supreme Court, which consisted then of 3 judges. Two of the 3 judges owned land in the territory that was under challenge. And the third one was married into a family that was involved in the case. Although the lawyers on both sides agreed to let the Supreme Court hear the case, they trusted their veracity. One still refused to hear it. Judge Priestley McBride, who wrote the final decision, claimed that DeLisle's claim was void long after the state had claimed the land, and DeLisle had not really given up his ownership of the lands in New Madrid until 1842, meaning that he had no valid claims on any land in Jefferson City. The other judge, William Napton, disagreed, and since there was no majority opinion, that meant the circuit court ruling still stood. And so the case went to the United States Supreme Court, which heard the case in December of 1851, and Judge John Catron wrote the final ruling in favor of the state. So more than 30 years after Missouri joined the Union and more than a quarter century after the permanent seat of government was moved to Jefferson City, it appeared the last legal challenge to its existence had been wiped out. More than 50 years later, the state bought Thomas Lawson Price's mansion, tore it down, and in 1907 built the Supreme Court building there. The next struggle for control of Jefferson City and the capital itself was not a legal one. It was war. Governor Claiborne Jackson, who concealed his Southern leanings when he ran for office in 1860, quickly showed his true colors in his inaugural address when he strongly denounced the Republican Party and its president-elect at the time, as having only one mission, which was the destruction of slavery. And he tied Missouri's future to the South. Early the next day, Jackson and his Lieutenant Governor, Thomas C. Reynolds, met in the Capitol basement with fellow Southern sympathizers to discuss a plan to take Missouri to the South. Reynolds already had held some secret meetings in Washington with congressional leaders from Southern states, laying the groundwork for the seizure of the federal arsenal in St. Louis, steps to weaken the free soil leadership of the city, and efforts to increase Southern-leaning paramilitary groups. Legislative moderates were able to pass a bill asking citizens to elect a constitutional convention to discuss what actions the state should take, and required a statewide vote on any act of secession. Voters surprised, perhaps shocked Jackson and his colleagues by electing a convention of 99, not one of whom was a Southern-leaning Democrat. A week after the attack on Fort Sumter, and after Governor Jackson rejected President Lincoln's call for governors to enlist 75,000 men, 4,000 of them here in Missouri, to defend the Union by writing, "Not a man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry out such an unholy crusade," convention delegates voted there was no reason for Missouri to leave the Union. Things came to a head in May of 1861 when the Federal Army seized Camp Jackson in St. Louis, a camp that Governor Jackson had seen as a staging area for the seizure of the federal arsenal. The legislature recalled for a special session that night. It took only a quarter hour to pass Jackson's bill calling for the enrollment of all able-bodied Missouri men to defend the state against federal invasion. The legislature voted to transfer all state school funds along with $1 million from the state bank and another $1 million of state defense bonds to finance what became the Missouri State Guard. Sterling Price became the commander. Now, Jackson and Price met in St. Louis with General William S. Harney, who commanded this area, the Department of the West. They made an agreement that Harney would not move troops outside of St. Louis if Jackson and Reynolds kept the rest of the state peaceful. The two came back to Jefferson City, where the Confederate flag was run up the pole at the governor's mansion. Not the one we have now, but early Union partisans found the Harney-Price agreement untenable. They arranged for Harney's removal, replaced by Nathaniel Lyon, who began building his forces. Jackson and Price, seeing the agreement with Harney blown up, set up a meeting with Lyon at the Flanders House Hotel in St. Louis, and he would have nothing to do with their plans. He was direct, rather than concede to the state of Missouri for one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any manner, however unimportant. He said, I would see you and you and you and every man and woman and child in the state dead and buried. This means war. And he stormed out of the room. Jackson and other state officials quickly dashed back to Jefferson City, arrived at 2 a.m. He quickly arranged for a proclamation to be published calling for armed resistance to the federal invasion. He gathered up as many records, including the state seal, and headed for Boonville on the 13th of June. Lyon and 2,000 Union soldiers were in Jefferson City within 48 hours. Lyon and his troops aboard the steamboat Iatan disembarked just below the penitentiary on June the 15th and quickly occupied the high ground. There was a special correspondent for the St. Louis, Missouri Democrat who described an enthusiastic reception from the loyal citizens headed by Thomas L. Price. They marched in good order through the city, cheered at several points, and finally occupied Capitol Hill amidst tremendous applause. The American flag was raised on the Capitol cupola. Old ladies wept, and everyone seemed overjoyed at the sight once more of the old flag, the correspondent wrote. The correspondent wrote from the Capitol cupola, hot is a word which but faintly conveys the idea of the unpleasant sensation experienced by your correspondent while marching through the streets of the capital of the state. A tune that he said the people had so long desired to hear but had not been able to hear in what was then Confederate Jefferson City created a spark of loyalty within the people there. The tune was the Star Spangled Banner, which was still several decades away from being our national anthem. Now General Lyon left Colonel Henry Bornstein behind in order to restore and maintain peace and order in the city, while he took his troops upstream for a confrontation with Price and Boonville. Bornstein had only 3 companies of 120 men, each in what he considered a vulnerable and exposed place that only hours before had been the center of secessionist activity. And he wrote in his journal, if the secessionists had understood their craft a bit better, they could have taken my 3 companies and me without anything to be done about it. The enlisted men were billeted in the House of Representatives. The officers were quartered in the Senate. Bornstein took over the Secretary of State's office. But the situation was so tense that there was little sleep that night, he said. And to keep pro-Southern interests in this town and the surrounding countryside from trying to recapture the city, he banned everyone but soldiers from the capital and sent regular patrols out to give the impression that he had more forces than they thought he did. He then arrested 5 of the most compromised citizens, imprisoned them in the Capitol basement, and everything, he said, became suddenly quiet. He ordered new patrols arranged in the counties to seize contraband and arrest people considered dangerous, including 7 Methodist and Baptist ministers who were the most rabid agitators for secession, as he said, preaching everywhere against the Union and advocating rebellion. The worthy servants of the Lord, as he called them, were locked in the Capitol cellar, and they were fed bread and water. The return of a company of troops from the field with reports that the ministers had been involved in the fatal attack on a Home Guard unit in Cole Camp, west of Jefferson City, inflamed the soldiers against those ministers. Bornstein rushed to the Capitol one day after learning that a lynching was imminent in the rotunda. The highly agitated men had already suspended 7 ropes from the gallery of the rotunda, and I arrived just as the speaker was being applauded for moving that the 7 fellows be dragged out of the cellar and hanged, he wrote. He quickly ordered his captains to form their companies and march them out of town. He had the ministers taken to a steamboat on the way to Boonville, parading them through the town where they had to stop whenever there was an American flag and bow to it. The last he heard, the 7 ministers were in Boonville, and they were digging ditches for fortifications. I've tried to find out who they were, and so far I haven't been able to locate any names of these 7, who just barely escaped an atrocity in the rotunda of our capital. Commanders of Jefferson City changed a lot, especially early in the war. One who was here for a very short time was new Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, who found most of the troops without clothing, camp, and garrison equipage. He wrote, ammunition was down to about 10 rounds of cartridges, and for the artillery, none is left. He set out to cure that problem and was making progress when one day Jefferson Davis walked into his office and told him to get out of town. And Grant was on a boat to St. Louis in an hour. In this case, it was Union Colonel Jefferson C. Davis, who relieved Grant of command and told him to hustle to St. Louis, or he was ordered to take command of the Southeast Division in Cape Girardeau. Davis then built the fortifications for fighting off an attack on Jefferson City. He planned then to go on an offensive, but the Army would not give him the equipment to do so, and there are some who think that the Army's refusal to give him the equipment here led to the surrender in Lexington of the Union forces several months later, because they couldn't get any help from the capital. The Federal forces were finally strengthened in the fall when General Fremont's troops established Camp Lilly, probably on the high area south of the capital where St. Mary's Hospital used to be, which is right across the intersection here. Jefferson City assumed some sort of normality until the fall of 1864, when General Sterling Price invaded Missouri, hoping to take it for the Confederacy, and made Thomas C. Reynolds, now the governor since Claiborne Jackson had died, the legitimate governor of the state of Missouri. They also hoped to disrupt the election process, where Abraham Lincoln was clinging to a narrow lead in that campaign. They were hoping that enough could be done out here, that enough votes would swing to George McClellan, who was more likely to make a deal with the South that would allow the Confederacy to survive. Price decided St. Louis could not be taken. He suffered a major setback at Iron Mountain, and then he aimed for Jefferson City. By the time Price's troops could see the American flag floating from our capital, thousands of Union soldiers were waiting behind fortifications. More were on their way. Price, having received positive information, he said that the enemy were 12,000 strong in the city, and 3,000 more had arrived on the opposite bank of the river, consulted with his commanders, and decided not to attack Jefferson City, but to move on instead. An attack at Jefferson City would have involved house-to-house fighting. It probably would have destroyed the city, probably would have destroyed the capital that Governor Reynolds, Lieutenant Governor Reynolds, wanted to take over as the legitimate governor. In fact, the Union force here was only about 7,200, with only 6,000, half the number of Price's command, considered to be reliable. The legal challenge to the state capital now had been resolved. A war challenge had been turned aside. A new constitution said the legislature could not change the location of the seat of government. Jefferson City's future seemed to be secure. In the next few years, the Capitol Press Corps would include Eugene Field for a couple of years, a man who later became the well-known children's poet, and Henry Morton Stanley, who was here for a few months before embarking on a greater adventure, including locating the lost Dr. Livingston in Africa. Livingston, of course, knew where he was all the time, but the New York Herald didn't, and it wanted to build circulation, so it hired Stanley, a former Confederate prisoner in Missouri, before he became a reporter, to go find him in Africa. But trouble in the state capital was brewing. By 1875, our state capital now was 35 years old, and it was showing the wear and tear. The creation of new counties produced crowded legislative chambers, and an 1875 resolution said that the Supreme Court should be here. So when they did that, crowded it even more. The place was poorly ventilated, among other things. There was mold in it, and when 2 representatives died in the 1875 session, the environment in the Capitol was one of the suspected reasons. A special committee issued a scathing report on the condition of the building and demanded better heating and ventilation, a recommendation that went nowhere. Improvements in the Capitol often are recommended but don't go anywhere. A local architect did draw plans for 2 wings to be added to the building, but the 1877 legislature didn't do anything about them, although it did put up money for building a new building for the court. There were people who were watching all of this, 60 miles to the west of Jefferson City. The town of Sedalia, which was platted in 1860, had more people in it than Jefferson City had by 1870. By the end of the next decade, the aggressive city leaders in Sedalia decided to take the seat of government away from Jefferson City. A bill was introduced in 1879 demanding a statewide vote. It failed, as did others, off and on, for the next several years. Jefferson City residents thought that they had stopped Sedalia, in 1887 when the legislature approved adding those 2 wings to the building. But Sedalia only paused and regrouped. A new dome built of pine and sheathed with copper also added 130 feet to the building's height. At the top was a lantern, a decorative structure in which people could climb up and step out on the outdoors walkway for a view of the city and the countryside. The original dome was removed and a redesigned dome was installed over the east portico. Jefferson City architect Frank Fuller, who did the brickwork for the Capitol, thought the additions ruined its beautiful simplicity and turned it into a monstrosity of neither beauty nor character. The addition of the wings to the Capitol appeared to take some of the wind out of the Capitol removal efforts in Sedalia. The 1889 session, the first one held with the new wings, the journals totaled 2,945 pages, and only once does the word Sedalia appear in those journals that year. But that doesn't mean Sedalia was quiet. Sedalia was plotting. At 2 o'clock in the morning, February 20th, 1895, an eastbound Missouri Pacific passenger train arrived at the station. A large number of people got off, and by daybreak they were organized and they were ready to strike. The 1895 legislative session was settling into a rhythm, as legislative sessions do after about 6 weeks. The House of Representatives was going to begin its 40th day of work, and a force from Sedalia was in the building, and Jefferson City didn't know they were there. Sedalia Representative John Bothwell rose from his seat at 10:05 a.m., buttoned his coat and said simply, "Mr. Speaker, I desire to introduce a resolution." It proposed to vote at the general election in November of 1896. Whenever a suitable Capitol building having the same or greater floor area and appointments as the present Capitol and Supreme Court buildings had been built by November of 1899, said the proposition, the seat of government would move west. Bothwell moved the rules be suspended and the proposition go to an immediate vote. Kansas City Representative John Crisp supported the bill, told of the aches and pains to which flesh is heir in Jefferson City, lack of hotel facilities, lack of railroad facilities, lack of enterprise, and a surplus of hills, valleys, bad beer, bad whiskey, bad water, and unsightly streets. Jefferson City and Cole County representatives could not stop the proposal, which passed more than 2-1 in the House. Senator Charles Yeater of Sedalia led the effort in his chamber. The rules were suspended there too. The vote was taken. 26 ayes, 7 nays. A glorious victory for Sedalia, said the Sedalia Democrat that evening. Poor old Jefferson City, dumbfounded when confronted with her unpopularity, was one of the 10 stacked headlines in the edition of the newspaper. The Sedalia ambush of 1895 had finally given the city the statewide vote that it had wanted since 1879. But the Jefferson City Daily Tribune cautioned, in the first flush of success, our Sedalia friends should remember that they have only won a skirmish and they are in a long ways from victory in a real fight. Jefferson City had 20 months to answer its critics and to question the capability of those who were celebrating a one-day victory to carry out the claims and dreams. During the next 20 months, Jefferson City made several improvements, chief among them being a bridge across the Missouri River that linked the city with North Missouri and its railroads and made access to the city far easier. And on election day, almost 65% of the voters statewide decided to leave the seat of government here. So now the last legal challenge was gone, the last wartime challenge was long past, now the last political challenge to the state capitol had been dispensed with. Only a disaster could endanger the city's future. The 20th century brought scandal to the Capitol when Creighton Brooks, a young minister of the Christian church here in town, said one night there were men who had never had $1,000 in their lives who were going around offering $1,000 for a vote. Newspapers picked up the story. A special legislative investigative committee got suspicious answers. A grand jury investigation led by the St. Louis Circuit Attorney indicted 4 members of the Senate for taking bribes from the Royal Baking Powder Trust of New York. The money was being used to buy votes to describe the ingredients of baking powder so that only Royal Baking Powder could be made and sold in Missouri. The lieutenant governor resigned after confessing that he had been the bagman carrying the bribes to the senators from Royal Baking Powder. None of these people ever went to prison. They were never fully convicted and their convictions upheld. The young prosecutor, Joseph Folk, was elected governor in 1904 and got strict limits put on lobbying in the Capitol. The Missourians were asked to approve a bond issue in November of 1910 to build a new capitol in Jefferson City. It was the fifth of 11 issues on the ballot, one of which was statewide prohibition, although about 80 of Missouri's 114 counties already were dry in their local option. St. Louis interests fought the idea, and they suggested that all 11 proposals be voted down so that prohibition would not be enacted, and sure enough, everything failed, although the capital bonds failed by the smallest margin. 87 days after that election, Mother Nature cast her vote. 32 years ago, I talked with an old man who remembered looking out the kitchen window of his grandmother's house on the night of February 5th, 1911, to see a massive bolt of lightning streak right past the house, and almost immediately there was a tremendous explosion, at least that's how he remembered it, that shook the house. He was always convinced he'd seen a comet, and he was always convinced the comet had struck the dome of the Capitol. What he had seen was the lightning bolt that hit that copper-clad dome. The pine wood interior, more than 2 decades dry, caught fire immediately. Fire wagons drawn by horses, others by men, rushed to the scene, but the flames pushed the firefighters down the stairway of the dome and then spread to the roofs of the building. The mayor called Sedalia and asked for help from the city fire department. A special train delivered the firefighters from Sedalia to here in 70 minutes. But by then, the principal water main had broken, and all the firemen could do was stand by and wait for the fire to burn itself out. Fortunately, Governor Hadley, legislators, news reporters, and others had gotten out most of the important records, including the document that made Missouri the first slave state to renounce slavery. Also included in the items rescued was the state seal that Confederate Governor Thomas C. Reynolds had taken with him when he and Governor Jackson fled in June of 1861. He returned it in 1867. Even as the fire raged, there were people from St. Louis who were talking about moving the seat of government there. University City really wanted it, but as often happens, St. Louis City and St. Louis County couldn't get along, so all of that strategy died out. But there was a peach farmer from West Plains who would try to get it. He would not give up. His name was J. Torrey, a Missouri native who'd become a cattle rancher and a politician in Wyoming as a young man, the third Speaker of the House in Wyoming when that state came into the Union, and afterward he'd become a lobbyist in Washington. And as the country moved toward war with Cuba, he came up with the idea that the best way to fight that war would be with cowboys, men who could ride, move fast, and shoot accurately from horseback. He got a bill introduced in Congress to create a unit that he wanted to call the Rough Riders. An ally of an ambitious New York politician named Theodore Roosevelt hijacked this bill, expanded it, got it passed. Roosevelt, of course, became the Rough Rider hero, but Torrey got to head a unit which never left Florida. The bond proposal for a new capital needed a 2/3 vote in August of 1911. If it failed, a second larger bond issue would go to the voters in November of 1912, and unlike the 1911 bond issue, this one would not designate Jefferson City as the site for the new capital. All Torrey needed was 1/3 of the vote to have a chance in 1912. But Missourians decided to keep the capital by voting 75% in favor of the bond issue in 1911. Jefferson City celebrated with a new Capital Day. A special 4-member commission was appointed to oversee the construction, men of high integrity. E.W. Stevens was a publisher and major civic leader from Columbia. Former House Speaker Alfred Speer, a banker from Chamois, who later would move to Jefferson City. Former state representative and former labor commissioner J.C.A. Hiller from Glencoe, and Theodore LeCaff of Nevada, a contractor who put up several buildings for the state. They decided to hold a contest to pick an architect, but the American Institute of Architects got in the way. The AIA had a new contest set of rules, and the contest chairman, Frank Miles Day, said the proposed contest rules in Missouri were not proper. At one time, the AIA threatened to kick out any members of the organization who got into this contest for Missouri. The dispute was finally resolved after a year. The contest was cleared by the AIA, and 69 architects applied to design our new capital. The commission cut the number down to 10 and picked a design by Tracy and Swartout from New York, a firm that had never built a capital but had earned some notoriety with its other work. Everett Tracy and Edgerton Swartout had worked for the biggest architectural firm of their time before forming their partnership. Tracy ran his own company for 7 years before Swartout joined him in 1901. He retired from the firm in 1915 and began a military career with the Army Engineers, becoming one of the leaders of a new camouflage program in the Army and leading his partner to actually oversee the project. So the hero of our Capitol story is Swarthout. Records of the commission indicate that the Capitol project was almost entirely his even before Tracy left. It was Swarthout who carried the responsibility and at times was overwhelmed by the pressures of the job. One of his contemporaries remembered he did not set out deliberately to make himself an architect in the sense that he did not study in any architectural school, but he loved beauty instinctively and he had a holy horror of the commonplace. And so he found himself in the architect's office and he did not remain a pencil pusher. The new building wasn't going to be finished anytime soon. Legislature needed a place to meet. They finished out the 1911 sessions with the Senate in Division I of the Supreme Court. The House used a school hall at the nearby Catholic Church, not far from the ruins of the Capitol, but those facilities weren't there for 1913. So a temporary Capitol was erected. It was, if anything, as much a fire trap as the old building. And at one time there were concerns that it was not be strong enough to hold all of the people who crammed inside it for the inauguration of Governor Major in 1913, until the architect said, no, it's okay, so go on. The architects for the new building selected. Now it was time to pick, to break the ground, although no contractor had been picked yet. So the ground was broken on May the 6th, 1913, and Theo LeCaff had the honor of turning the first shovelful of dirt. The search for a general contractor was underway by then. 6 companies put in bids. The board chose the John F. Gill Construction Company of Cleveland. Company president Kermode Gill was in charge and became a major headache. By now, various stone companies have been sending in efforts to provide stone for the building, although the commission's guidelines call for stone to come only from operating and open quarries in Missouri. Gill, the contractor, however, seemed to have hoped to increase his profit by opening his own quarry. He had immediately gone to Indiana, Bedford, Indiana, for a meeting with Charles Ingalls of the Ingalls Stone Company. And they set up a corporation in Missouri and got people in St. Genevieve all exercised about talk they were going to open a granite quarry there to provide the stone for the new Capitol. That ignited a year-long feud with the Capitol Commission Board. Gill refused time and again to meet with them or even talk about this idea of his. Months went by before he finally gave up on St. Genevieve, and when he and Ingalls went to Cassville, which had a small quarry, and Ingalls got them to give him a financial incentive to open it, he carried on with the commission as if there was still nothing wrong. Ingalls used money borrowed by Gill to get some big equipment sent to Cassville. Gill was hedging his bets because he by now had started negotiating for the purchase of Carthage stone. He complained the quarry companies there had gotten together to demand much too high prices, so he finally abandoned Cassville, leaving Ingalls holding the bag and triggering a couple of big lawsuits between the two men that went on for years and produced 4,000 pages of evidence in the Greene County Circuit Court before it was finally resolved out of court in the 1920s. Unfortunately, it appears all those 4,000 pages of evidence have disappeared. You can't find them anywhere. So many of you have friends that like to go prowling around Greene County's basement. You might see if you can find 4,000 pages of information for us. Gill got into the quarrying business in Carthage. He cut his own stone. He finally got to work putting up the building after a year of driving the commission absolutely crazy. Once he got started, the work went fairly quickly, although one troublesome issue cropped up when the commission noticed most of the stone going into the building had peculiar half-moon stains. It turned out the stone pieces had holes in the sides of them. They're called Lewis holes. And they were there to put rods into so workmen could carry the pieces of stones around. Well, in the wintertime, somebody had put salt into those holes to keep water that accumulated in there from freezing and thus cracking the stone. And when the water dried out, the salt remained and it was soaking through or working its way back through the stone. Eventually it was cleared up, but it bothered the commission no end for a while. Finally, on September 13, 1917, Gill's on-site superintendent, David Ehrenberg, presented a large ring of keys to E.W. Stevens, formally turning the building over to the state of Missouri. The bonds paid off the building quickly, and there was $1 million left over for a special decoration commission that was appointed to decorate the building. They hired the finest artists and sculptors and glass stained glass workers and tapestry experts to tell a version of Missouri history on the walls and windows of our building. Next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the first full legislative session held in the Capitol. Among other things, that year, the legislature ratified the federal amendment letting women vote for president. It also reenacted the death penalty. And the result of all of this work is a striking 500,000 square foot building that covers 3 acres, contains 26 million cubic feet, towering over a broad river, a visual delight, the curve and angle, carving, inscriptions, arches, colored glass, the bronze statues, carved marble decorations, great canvases that added $1 million worth of artwork to the building. It had taken 5,200 tons of steel, 4,650,000 bricks to build that, together with 40,376 barrels of cement. Windows used 17,372 square feet of polished glass, along with 8,379 square feet of emery ground glass and another 5,715 square feet of cathedral glass. 134 columns contained 1/4 of all the stone of the building. The construction cost was a little over $4 million. It has enough steel to build a railroad 30 miles long, enough bricks to stretch 631 miles if they're laid end to end, 240,000 cubic feet of exterior stone, enough to fill 650 railroad cars to capacity. 1 million cubic feet of stone to be quarried to produce the stone for the exterior, and the additional 100,000 cubic feet used for the interior. But there was a cost beyond all of this. 5 men died on site building this building, and 2 more were killed in Carthage at the quarry. 2 other workers were killed there, as I mentioned earlier. The Capitol was finally dedicated in 1924 with a big parade, afternoon ceremonies on the south front steps, and a big pageant that night, cut short by a violent rainstorm, perhaps appropriate because the story of this building began from a rainstorm. The Capitol has endured the ebb and flow of Missouri politics in the first century, a depression, recession, wars, celebrations, including the reunion of the Apollo 11 astronauts on the first anniversary of the moon landing. Republican Walthall Moore in 1920 became the first African American to be elected to the House, failed to be reelected the next year, but he succeeded for 3 more terms. A second African American representative came in 1928. Those African American members of the legislature had to stay in private homes or at Lincoln University until a housing ordinance was passed in Jefferson City in the 1960s to let them have hotel rooms. The first 2 women in the Missouri General Assembly were elected in 1922, Melsine Thurman Smith, Democrat from St. Louis, and Sarah Lucille Turner, who was from Kansas City. Turner died in 1957. In 1972, the year Turner died, 11 women were elected to the House, including DeVern Calloway of St. Louis, the first African-American woman state representative who that year was chosen for her 5th term. The first woman to achieve leadership position in the House was Gracia Yancey Baker, a New Bloomfield Democrat who became the majority floor leader in 1996. The first African-American elected to the Senate was Theodore McNeil of St. Louis in 1960, 17 years before Gwen Giles of St. Louis became the first black woman elected to the state Senate. Jet Banks of St. Louis, widely known for his numerous colorful suits complete with matching shoes and pipes he wore on the final days of the legislative session, became the first minority majority floor leader in the state Senate. The building at 201 West Capitol Avenue remains today a structure of solid but complicated character, of grace and beauty and art, constructed despite many difficulties and even some tragedy. It represents a solid but complicated state that has borne its own difficulties and tragedies, but nevertheless has its own grace and beauty and art. And now it's being prepared for a major restoration that will take most of the next 2 years, but prepared for its 2nd century. It is a building occasionally stained, as was its original stone, by what happens within, that represents a state with occasional stains in its own heritage. Time and circumstance reduce the stains in the building, as well as the state in the state, leaving memories of them, and one hopes lessons learned from them. The Missouri Capitol has stood through hot summers and frigid winters, rising from and above its struggles, an inspiration to those who see its architectural elegance and its experience, its artistic excellence, as a shining reminder that greatness and grandeur still do exist and can be sought, even in a building that remains a political lightning rod for the state of Missouri. And so we can wonder, if a building has those capabilities, is it too much to expect that the people it represents and those who serve in it are capable of the same achievements in overcoming the problems that they have and in uniting to solve them? The answer lies in a future that in time will generate new chapters for the history of our great building. Thank you.